Good morning. It's wonderful to be here. And I should say that I'm presenting this project on behalf of my co-authors, many of whom I think are here today. So I'll save any difficult questions for them, if that's okay. Kilmartin Glen, part of which hidden under the screen sharing. I didn't need to include a map of where Kilmartin Glen is, I hope. But for anyone who isn't sure, it's south of Oban and just a bit north of Loch Gilphead on the west coast. It is, of course, renowned for its concentration of, in particularly, prehistoric monuments, starting with an enormous Neolithic cursus through to really famous sites like a linear cemetery of enormous Bronze Age funerary cairns. And of course, the subject of today, there are thousands of rock carvings. They range from simple cut marks to complex designs. And really well-known sites like Achnabrec in this slide are among Scotland's largest and most elaborate rock art sites. Now, rock art like this is part of a much wider phenomenon. Comparable motifs are found across Scotland, across the north of England, parts of Wales, parts of Ireland, and down the west coast of Atlantic Europe. But of course, the question always is, why did people go to all the effort of creating these symbols? Just see some there in the foreground. How old are they? And what might they mean? And these questions have been asked since rock art was first recognized, and hundreds of explanations have been proposed. I'm sure there are even more explanations in this room. Everyone has their own ideas about rock art, which is really quite exciting. Recent decades have seen some fresh approaches, and I think some of those approaches have transformed understanding. And I'm particularly referring to investigations in the Kilmartin area between around 2004 and 2009, which revealed, I think, unprecedented insights into the creation and the dating of rock art. One of those projects was excavations at Torvlaren, led by Andy Jones, which focused on 3 rock outcrops, which display cup and ring markings. There's no point searching for the cup and ring markings in this image. They're almost invisible at this time of day, but at least you can see where one of the trenches of the excavations was located. The finds were incredible. Over 40, mostly quartz. The left. Hammerstones were uncovered, both around the rocks, around their edges, but also within crevices upon their surfaces. And experimental replication indicated that those hammerstones had very likely been used to carve rock art motifs. There are also large quantities of fractured quartz on the right, pieces of worked flint, and pieces of Arran pitchstone. Of course, rock art is notoriously difficult to date, but some of those hammerstones were found in association with charcoal, and that indicated that cup and ring markings were very likely being made at Torvlaren through the later Neolithic and into the Bronze Age. Hammerstones, worked quartz, have since been found at other sites, including excavations at Ormeig, also near Kilmartin, and another project I was involved with at 5 outcrops on the slopes of Ben Lawes overlooking Loch Tay. And I should just add that 1 or 2 pieces of Arran pitchstone that also came from these trenches I noticed are on display in the new Perth Museum when I went to a visit yesterday, which is really exciting. Now, pollen evidence from one of the panels at Ben Lawes was found in association with hammerstone debris, and that revealed that those carvings were very likely being made in an open environment, not unlike the landscape we see on Ben Lawes today. And I think that's a really significant outcome. We didn't get dating, but that environmental evidence really helps to confirm or to help us to think through ideas that rock art has been placed in locations which might be significant, for instance, in relationship to routeways, to viewpoints, and perhaps to other monuments. The use of quartz is itself suggestive. This is one of the artifacts from Torvlaren, now in Kilmartin Museum's collections, since quartz actually has quite distinctive properties. And that's not just this sort of semi-translucent crystalline sparkle that these objects exhibit and when they catch the light, but they also can emit in certain conditions an eerie glow known as triboluminescence. And many carvings were located where they are highlighted by low sunlight. This is a little nod to some of my other landscape field work in the Kilmartin area, where a few observations over a number of years revealed that the entire outcrop at Achnabrec is actually aligned upon the mid-winter sunset. So excavation, back to the subject, has proven to be invaluable at a number of sites, but very few have actually been explored in any detail. So in September 2023, Kilmartin Museum and Archaeology Scotland joined forces to undertake a community archaeology project to investigate cup and ring markings at Carnasserie Farm, which is at the northern limit of Kilmartin Glen. So here's the linear cemetery looking north, and Carnasserie is all these green hills in the middle distance. That's where the project was located. The work was funded by National Heritage Lottery Fund as part of Kilmartin Museum's recent redevelopment. Quick plug, do visit our new museum. Carnasserie is a diverse archaeological landscape, as is encapsulated in this single photograph. And it's been recorded in detail by the museum's walkover surveys, as well as other projects, sites ranging from a dramatic hilltop cairn, Carn Ban at the top, to post-medieval settlements in the foreground. The 3 rock art sites that we investigated were located towards the southern boundary of the farm, overlooking the upper part of Kilmartin Glen. That's Kilmartin Village, just visible there. All were carved into metabasite rock, and all had previously been recorded by Scotland's Rock Art Project. Our aim was to contextualize 3 contrasting rock art sites in relation to both natural and cultural features in the landscape, to reveal the full extent of the recorded motifs and to record evidence for any associated features, deposits, or artifacts. The project was also designed to maximize opportunities for participation. It included student placements, fieldwork training, program of educational events that engaged with over 100 children, and more than 40 volunteers helped us with the digging. Let's look at the 3 sites. This is site 1 in the foreground. It's an inconspicuous bedrock slab. It displays, overgrown in this slide, the largest and most complex cup and ring markings known on Carnasserie Farm. We excavated 2 trenches. One was over here against that outcrop, and that explored a small quarry site, which displayed evidence of stone extraction using metal tools, probably medieval or post-medieval in date. But the second trench was around that decorated stone, revealing the full extent of the carvings. Carvings in the top left, and they were recorded using photogrammetry. And this is a model from the photogrammetry. And it clearly shows how those carvings were fitted onto the rock surface and framed to either side of what in this slide this appears to be a diagonal crack. We were very intrigued by what could be described as an artificial scalloped edge. It's partly visible in the photogrammetry on that left corner there, but in these sort of artificially textured images, There's this scalloped edge. It looks very different to the sharp and angular appearance of the quarried surface right nearby. And this had not been made using metal tools. There it is again going up the left edge of the rock, and it's very weathered, and a geologist, Dr. Roger Anderton, inspected it and considered it to be of significant antiquity. And it's intriguing that it actually seems to, in many ways, emphasize the shape of that carving. It also appears, just looking at the slide, yes, our trench stops quite soon after the edge of the rock, but it looks like a substantial volume of rock may have been removed, perhaps even in prehistory. A split stone, must need a ladder, but no, I can see it. There's a split stone and this block of quartz, possibly a hammerstone, were the only finds, but very significantly, they'd been placed in the cavity left behind when this rock was extracted. On to site 2, which is also inconspicuous in the landscape, but in its own way, quite different in character. We opened this trench to explore the known concentration of markings. Several pieces of worked quartz were collected. The markings themselves included fairly large cut marks, alongside more unusual ovoid and elongated hollows, which are artificially enlarged natural features. To the existing record, we added a shallow cup and ring, you just see that here, and various other partial rings and a groove. And by exposing more of the rock surface, it really highlighted, as that motif in the foreground does, how the carvings are fitted into a pre-existing pattern of natural cracks. A second trench, that in the foreground here, was opened just below the carved outcrop at the top. Within this trench, we found unrecorded cut marks and several artifacts, including pieces of worked quartz and a retouched flint flake in the top right. A serrated or perhaps notched stone in the bottom right was found sealed by stone blocks from which a lens of charcoal was sampled, but as yet to be dated. Unfortunately, neither the charcoal nor these artifacts could be stratigraphically associated with the carvings. Last but not least, our site 3 contrasts with the others. It's more upstanding. It has almost nearly vertical surfaces. It's more conspicuous in the local landscape. Just above this small scar, there is a sloping panel with simple cut marks, and just beyond that is a really unusual triangular fin of rock. And that's just on the right here, which has over 20 cut marks and a ring. And as you can see, we opened one trench here to explore the area between those two groups of carvings, but no artifacts or additional carvings were located. A second trench at the base of the scarp revealed evidence of medieval or post-medieval quarrying. That layer of close set stones, which was placed upon bedrock, had these large angular flakes of rock included within it, and some of those bear substantial scratch marks that look like they were made with metal tools. There was a very small quantity of worked quartz in that area, but very excitingly, when we removed that layer of stones, in this angular crevice that was sealed by the stones, we found this amazing split quartz flake. And I do wonder whether that might be a deliberate deposit. So the post-excavation analysis of this project is ongoing, but can we begin to say or interpret any of the findings from this pilot study at Carnasserie Farm? Well, each site certainly reveals a biography which extends from geological and glacial processes through to post-medieval quarrying. But interestingly, there was no evidence that more recent extraction had damaged any of the rock art. As I've already mentioned, prehistoric artifacts, or very likely to be prehistoric artifacts, were present, although there was only one possible hammerstone. But overall, I mean, it's great to have these results in rock art sites, but the density of struck quartz is arguably quite modest in comparison with assemblages like Torvlaren or Meg and Ben Lawes. And that's not doing a statistical analysis, it's just really an intuition that even though the areas excavated were smaller, the densities really very much seemed lower. And maybe that would be expected if quartz debitage was to be interpreted as a residue of rock art creation, in which case its density might vary in proportion to the extent and complexity of carvings. But interestingly, the density of struck stone from each of the Carnasserie sites does not in itself correlate with the extent of the carvings in each. And that's really well illustrated at site 1, the largest motif, but it produced the fewest finds. Just going to draw a wider comparison with actually Claire Ellis's excavations around a boulder bearing 29 cut marks, I think it is, at Upper Gascon near Tummel Bridge. And that site produced 350 pieces of work quartz for 29 cut marks and 2 hammerstones. So there's clearly something interesting happening about proportions of debris and hammerstones and complexity of rock art. I think that's something that certainly needs to be explored, particularly as several factors might be at play. And that could be, of course, the relative hardness of bedrock, whether material was removed in prehistory, the lithology that was chosen to be used as hammerstones, and of course later disturbance, where we choose to put our trenches, the size of the trenches, etc. But I do also think that the presence of the worked flint and this really interesting notched artifact perhaps also hints that rock art production was not the only activity taking place at these locations. And that's very much a pattern that follows other sites that have been excavated. And the discovery of that lovely split piece of struck quartz within a crevice at site 3 is, I think, reminiscent of the deliberate placing of deposits within cracks and fissures. At Torvlaren, bottom left, seems to be some kind of structured deposit with a split stone placed to either side of a hammerstone. And also we had very similar evidence during excavations that I undertook with Richard Bradley at Urlar in Strathtay. Also, as our team became increasingly familiar with Carnasserie's undulating topography, some additional observations emerged. Site 1 in the foreground there is the most complex, but it also has the widest views. It has monuments nearby, it overlooks a junction between routeways, and is within sight and sound of a waterfall. Sites 2 in the foreground, 3 just up there in the middle ground, both occupy an upland basin surrounded by springs. Site 2's large and shallow cut marks distinguish it from the other panels, but in some way I think they have closer parallels with markings on sites like this, Bronze Age standing stones and also kiss slabs in the Kilmartin area. And that parallel with monuments is intriguing because some of the deliberately enhanced natural hollows on that panel recall irregular markings, and that's sort of these ones here, which the excavator at Netherlargy North in Kilmartin Glen, James Hewitt Craw, thought to be representations of artifacts, and that's aside from the amazing flat axes on the panel. photogrammetry has revealed other examples of possible artifacts in the Kilmartin area, including this possible hafted example in Netherlargy Mid. And this is going out on a little bit of a stretch perhaps, but there is an intersection between natural features at Site 2, which I think is also reminiscent of the broad shape of a hafted artifact. It is artificially created and its interior is repeatedly hammered using a hammer stone. It's clearly more ambiguous than those flat axe heads elsewhere in Kilmartin Glen, but its proximity of this panel to some of the few monuments anywhere in Britain and Ireland that display that kind of evidence, I think is really curious. Could that suggest the Bronze Age chronology for these acts of mark making here? Site 3, slightly different. It's part of, here's our trenches, it's part of this really intriguing linear rib of rock that runs across the landscape. And just across from it is an equivalent rib of rock, which contains a rock shelter bearing a cup and ring mark. And they delineate what could be described as a kind of monumental routeway or avenue, which leads from the excavated sites towards that highly suspicious mound on the skyline, which was excavated by Kilmartin Museum in 2015, and its summit is crowned by a kist burial. Thank you. So, just to pull things together, further fieldwork is clearly required on this project to expand upon the results of the pilot study. I think it would be valuable to extend the excavated areas, to look for more widely for structures or evidence of activities, to reveal the extent of stone extraction at Site 1. I think that would be fascinating. Could this have been a quarry for a standing stone or for kist slabs? We also need to consider the relationship between geological and cultural features, from these distinctive ribs of rock to natural standing stones, like the example in the foreground, which are more discrete. But could these natural places have been treated in special ways? I think a remarkable quality of Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments is not only how they celebrate spectacular connections between people and the sky and the land, but how they continue to inspire and influence us today. And several of the observations and ideas that I've outlined this morning emerged through animated discussions with our community of field workers, many of whom had never practiced archaeology before. But they spent time walking across and working in this landscape and recognized how their experiences were ultimately being influenced by symbols and structures created thousands of years before. In turn, our collective interventions have added a new chapter to the evolving story of these fascinating and enigmatic places. And that's where I'm going to end this morning. Thank you very much indeed.